Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. My guest today is Glenn Diesen, a renowned geopolitical analyst. I wanted to talk to Glenn about the recent Syrian revolution, identify all of the various stakeholders on the ground and what their unique incentives are. So we run through from top to bottom. We cover the US, Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, Syria, of course, and a few other actors that are playing a subtle role but are important. You're going to enjoy this conversation as much as I did, I'm sure. Here is Glenn Diesen. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
Okay, here I am with Glenn Diesen. Glenn, it's great to have you back in the program. Good to see you again.
Oh, good to see you again, Jay.
So I want to start, there's a handful of directions I want to go today, a handful of regions I want to cover today. Let's start in Syria. Here's how I'd like to begin this. From your perspective, who are the key stakeholders involved in the Syrian revolution, if you want to call it that? And then I want to unpack how you see their key incentives.
Well, yeah, that's a big question because there's a lot of stakeholders. Of course, you can, you can, of course, you should give some agency to locals because there is organic opposition, of course, or was organic opposition to Assad, so they have their own domestic element. But it would be, I guess, incorrect to suggest this is only a civil war or a local conflict because you also have a lot of foreign actors now. Obviously, the United States has been pushing very hard for toppling the Syrian government. Some of this can be traced back to the 1980s, but mostly it began around 2000. It began to intensify around 2005, especially then after the September 11 attacks in 2001. But it was really since 2011 the United States stepped it up. But if you look at a lot of the groups being supported now to topple Assad. This was Turkey, of course, pushing the hardest. They're the one who did the most in terms of arming HTS and also prepared them. Keep in mind that this wasn't some ragtag rebel group suddenly pouring in. They were very well armed. They came in armed columns, very well organized, weapons, drones, everything. So this was very much prepared by the Turks. And of course, you also have other interested parties. Israel, I think, would be a big one. It's many people can't help but to notice that Israel is bombing Syria, and the new authorities in Syria don't seem to have that much pushback against the Israelis. So I think at this point in time, they still see themselves as being not ready to sever these ties to Israel. But of course, you have Arab governments around the region. Iran is a very important one. It's important to keep in mind that the so-called resistance to Israel is very much been dependent on Syria. Syria is the land bridge between Iran and its allies in Lebanon and in Palestine, so Hezbollah and Hamas. So a lot of this becomes severed. So it's a very big game, if you will, and a lot of actors involved. Of course, you can't ignore Russia either. This is where it has its key naval base on the Mediterranean. They've been the main backer of Assad as well. They stepped in 2015 and effectively kept him in power against a Western-backed revolt, which included some cooperation with different jihadist groups. So it's a very messy situation, which is why I think the analysis suggests that we're now peace has arrived and now there will be stability in the Middle East. I think this is a very deceptive way to address what's happening.
Okay, and so beginning with some of the local organizations, HTS kind of being the central figure, you're right, lots of grassroots organization for sure. This is culmination after 13 years of civil war. And then really crescendoed, obviously, in 10 days, probably with support from a bunch of foreign actors, maybe Israel, maybe United States, maybe Ukraine. I've heard some conversation around Ukraine. Now, could that be the case that Syria is and has been a very important stronghold? It's Russian naval bases, very important and strategic Russian naval bases in terms of keeping them present close to Africa and throughout the Mediterranean. And then from Iran's standpoint, the Shia Crescent, right, the land bridge that connects the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, also very important for Iran. So the timing of this I thought was interesting. Could it be that because Iran is tied down in a different Middle Eastern war and Russia is tied down in their war with Ukraine, this was an opportune time for Israel, US, Ukraine, I'm not sure, to take a crack and fund and support HTS to the degree that they might have because the supporters of Assad were already stretched too thin? Is that a reasonable thesis? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it's it's a lack of evidence, of course, at the moment. We don't have
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
facts, but that being said, I think that's probably the strongest this will be in terms of what happened. It is also worth noting that this happened immediately after a ceasefire was announced in Lebanon, and this is hardly a coincidence either. And seemingly, what happened was Israel also began to bomb a lot of the crossing points between Lebanon and Syria as HTS was coming down from the north, so which would then prevent Hezbollah fighters from intervening. So it seemed to have been, opportunistic. Of course, you're very correct. The Russians were also put at to some extent, at a dilemma. What would they do? Would they send a lot of troops down to Syria to assist, but then again give up a little bit on the progress they're making in Ukraine? So they were a little bit forced to choose here. And I guess the choice was made for them when the Syrian army began to stand down. It's unclear exactly what happened there. Some might have been paid off. A lot of Russian soldiers, I know, they blamed the weak Syrian soldiers for stepping down, but the Syrian soldiers suggest that they were told to stand down. So there's still a lot of a lack of clarity, but I think it was opportunistic to a large extent, especially Erdogan. He saw an opportunity, but I think also, probably from the Israeli side, if you see what happened over the past year, Hamas has been exhausted. Hezbollah has also been hit pretty hard. And this was, and the Russians are now tied up in Ukraine. So it was an opportunity, I guess, to settle what they couldn't do in the past 13 years.
Another conversation I've seen has said that, the Ukrainians were actually quite involved covertly in funding and supporting maybe HTS and the sister and brother organizations with the intention of distracting Russia on another front. And maybe they ended up being more successful than they planned because now Russia's actually taken their hands off Syria. And if it was a distraction that was diluting their presence on the Ukrainian front, that's no longer the case. Those Russian troops, that equipment is back in Russia now. And any focus they needed to maintain protecting Assad is no longer required. And in that sense, if the rumors, are true that the Ukrainians were funding and supporting this uprising, it might have backfired a little bit in that now their opponents is not distracted as they were prior. Do you see any credence to a theory there?
And I think it's been quite heavily reported, and it fits that trend, I would say, because Ukraine has also been aiding different terrorist groups in Africa to attack Russia and its allies in the region. So, but this is something I think the Wall Street Journal also reported on, which is the Ukrainians they sent drone operators, a lot of drones as well, to Syria to assist in the attacks and the overthrow of Assad. But I think you're correct. The interest of Ukraine would be for Russia to be tied or dragged further down into the Syrian quagmire, and they would have to divert some of their troops, some of their resources away from Ukraine and send it to Syria to drain Russia there. I think this is what have definitely been more of an interest, but given that it was again too successful, HTS took power. You can ask, well, what is the ideal thing for Russia now? And for them, they would like to, of course, negotiate these bases with the existing authorities the new authorities in Syria. Now, to what extent is possible is not clear, because they're looking towards what's happening, and of course, the new government will begin to consolidate power. Once it has consolidated power, it's very unclear what it will do. Also, they will probably be under pressure from the United States to evict the Russians. So far, they suggested that they need a good relationship with Russia, but you don't want too many assets standing there on the ground, which are vulnerable to an attack. So they will try to negotiate keeping their bases, but they will nonetheless begin, at least that's what I've seen on the satellite photos, suggest that the Russians are already packing up and pulling out a lot of their equipment just to make themselves less vulnerable for an unpredictable situation. So they don't. So they're not going to fight the new government there. So I think it's better for them to pull out some of their resources and see how the pieces fall. And but again, this is why a lot of its equipment, especially Air Force soldiers, a lot of this is heading back to Russia, and it can put into the Ukrainian theater instead. So it could have been not what they initially hoped for. The same could be said for the United States. I think if they would have put huge pressure on Assad, you had a bit of a balance between the two. The U.S. could have negotiated a stronger position for itself. I think this HTS suddenly taking power. Keep in mind that the head of HTS has been on America's terror list. Mm-hmm. This is a former Al-Qaeda leader. So they probably they probably prefer if he had less power. So, I think this could have been a miscalculation on the Ukrainian part, because now the Russians are stepping up even further in Ukraine.
Yeah, it puts the U.S. in a bit of a quagmire, right? With Golani being on the terrorist watch list and HTS being a Al-Qaeda affiliate. What do you think is the probable, if you were to speculate, this HTS consolidates power, maybe runs some purges and reorganizes the country, maybe, or it kind of goes the way of Libya post-Gaddafi, which is very disorganized chaos in a very unstable country. If you were to put a higher probability on either of those two outcomes, does either one stand out to you as the more likely? And if so, who might be influencing those two outcomes?
Well, I think the Libya crisis is more problematic. It could be more problematic than Libya, simply because the amount of actors there. It's been such a huge. The anti-Assad alliance has had so many components to it, and I think without Assad, one has to question the foundation of this partnership. Again, HTS in Israel, this is now they're going to have an actual shared border. You know that the Israelis aren't too happy. They're happy that Assad got toppled, but they don't want them to be too powerful. So you see Israel now bombing quite heavily. HTS hasn't really yet turned on Israel. You see already, this has happened before, Turkish and American proxies fighting each other. And we don't know what's going to happen between the new authorities and the Syrian Kurds. Obviously, the Turks, who has a lot of influence over this new terror group that now rules Syria, they will want to have a minimal autonomy for the Kurds. The Americans want more to balance. They probably wouldn't mind balkanizing the country. So you have a lot of competing interests. And I also made the point that the different Arab governments, even Egypt, you might predict, would seek to have greater influence in Syria now that Assad is gone. And without this huge influence of Iran in Syria, one also have to question to what extent they're able to find some balance or some internal solidarity between the former allies. But I guess my main concern of what is not just unraveling of the anti-Assad alliance, which will more turn on each other, but it's also what's going to happen to Iran, that the whole conflict over Syria has a lot to do with Iran. And you can already see Israel destroying the vast majority of Syria's air defenses after Assad has been toppled. Now you can ask, why is Israel bombing more after the toppling of Assad than before? And I think they obviously want to clear out, well, not just conquering territory, but they also want a clear airspace corridor if they want to go and attack Iran. Because now, with Syria knocked out, you also have a weakened Hamas and Hezbollah, which means that Iran has become more exposed. So I would expect Israel to try to renew its efforts to pull America into a war with Iran. This has always been what Israel usually does, though. You want to isolate all the different actors and go after one at a time in order to have some control. And I think this, from Tel Aviv's perspective, this could be a historic opportunity, if you will, to go after Iran as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty, I guess, what's going to happen next. But I think it's going to be more complex than Libya, and it has the potential to draw in a lot of powerful actors. Keep in mind that Iran now also has some very powerful friends, China, Russia, being properly integrated into the SCO and BRICS. So I think, it's going to be very messy in the months or weeks ahead.
I hadn't thought about the air corridor as a reason why Israel was so aggressively bombing post-Assad in Syria. I kind of made the assumption Israel's intention there would be a consistently unstable Syria was just maybe in their best interest. That's how they were approaching this,
Well, I think that's correct as well, because you don't know what's going to happen in Syria. So, and
right.
Of course, the new government, they're not very reliable, irrespective of what the media trying to sell them as moderate rebels. Right. Until a few weeks ago, they were, recognized as jihadists. So I think there's an interest in keeping it weak, because there's a lot of military equipment now ending up in the hands of some possibly very irresponsible people. So there's also an interest, of course, to just degrade and destabilize. So as long as you keep the regional actors divided, weakened, and a little bit in chaos, then it's easier to control the region. And in the absence of any, I guess from Israel's perspective, any path to a stable peace, it's better to have weakened adversaries who are divided. So again, I'm not sure if an air corridor towards Iran is a key objective, but it is again, it's a lot of speculation what could happen, because there's too many uncertainties at the moment.
Yeah, right. What emphasis, if any, do you put on, what impact, if any, do you think a new American president might make? And maybe I ask this question from a standpoint of, for the last 4 years, you could say American leadership has been perceived as very weak. Maybe that's just my personal view. But in response to that, there's been a lot of shuffling on the geopolitical chessboard, because when the leadership's weak, it's a good time to make a move, a power move. And maybe we've seen a few of these power moves been attempted in the form of hot wars in many regions. Now we're seeing a shift of establishment back to a leader that the world may perceive as stronger or more aggressive, more somebody who's likely to force their order. Do you think that's the case? And do you expect any shift in geopolitical trends? Normally, I would say the American president doesn't make a big impact. I mean, that's the leader of any country. It's and the American president specifically, the Constitution is designed to limit the power of any one person. That was kind of the beauty of the American experiment. But maybe this is different. Do you think that a new leader will impact geopolitical trends this time?
It could. Again, whenever people ask about Donald Trump, it's a bit of a wild card, and I think it can go in different directions on this one. After they had failed to topple Assad in the past, America's position was to hold a lot of strategic territory, so especially the natural resources of Syria. So if you hold the natural economic resource of Syria, this was seen to be a way of not just a source of revenue, but mainly a source of influence in Syria for its future direction. Now, I think this is something the US will continue to use, given that Turkey, HTS, you have new actors coming into Syria. They will want to have a say, so they will probably seek to continue to hold these territories. They would want to possibly, as I said, strengthen the Kurds in order to have some balance to HTS. But it's unclear what Trump would do. I mean, he's in the past he's been, I guess, renowned for speaking more openly that, well, if he would try to pull out of Syria, but at least he would keep the oil. That was his words. Usually American presidents, the others would also seek to keep the oil as it is, but I guess he's more brazen in his rhetoric. But I think it's difficult to say what Trump's going to do, because on one hand, he's said he didn't want to do any more of this forever wars. He also wanted to focus American resources on Asia, as you know, this pivot to the east has been an objective since Obama's time. So there's a lot of reasons to expect why he wouldn't want to get too deeply involved in Syria. Also, key allies, be it from Musk and Gabbard and Kennedy, they also almost ideologically aligned with this idea of ending the forever wars. And this is going to be, I think, a very big mess for anyone who gets pulled in. But on the other hand, I think Trump would also recognize everything that's at stake at the moment. Also, he's quite strong on the support for Israel, and this is going to be a historical shift in Israel's history in terms of how it positions itself in the region. It assists in weakening Iran. It will reshape the entire region. So it would be hard to see how Trump would just stay out of the whole thing. So he would probably be, as you said, take a bit of a strongman position and try to influence the outcome, but probably without investing American troops, or at least not too many American troops into this.
Yeah. Okay. So wrapping that up a little bit, if we look at, Russia's incentives and desires here, it's probably to retain their naval bases, which are a key jump off point to their African centers of influence and power. And it's a strategic location for them in the Mediterranean. They want to retain those naval bases. If you look at Iran, it's very similar, retain a key ally, which looks like it's lost, but in addition, they've lost a key shipping route, being the Shia Crescent, the land bridge that connects the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Yeah, they can still go around the Horn of Africa, but it's not as convenient and probably more expensive. And also, it's sort of a conflict region right now. You look at a country like Israel. What they want is they want an unstable region in general. It seems they want vulnerability in the Middle East. I might say, that allows them to operate with a bit more autonomy as they wish, and they maybe want to clear an airway through to Iran in the event that something bigger were to happen between Israel and Iran. If you look at the U.S., it's kind of unclear what they might want to do here. Maybe they'll. Unless you think I've missed something there, but I feel like I'm least clear on the U.S. incentive. But before, and so add to that if you think, but if you could also for me, Glenn, just maybe expand a bit on Turkey's incentive, because we haven't talked about that one as much, but obviously they're a key player and have been for many years. And I'd love to just make sure I understand their key motivations and incentives as you see them.
I think the incentive could be almost summarized as a neo-Ottoman dream. That is, they of course want to assert a bit of more great power status. This is also reflected in their wider foreign policy. They have been quite successful and good at their multi-vector foreign policy in terms of diversifying their ties, not becoming too dependent on even allies, be it the United States. They're also unique in terms they want to have one foot in NATO and possibly one foot within BRICS. So they did this, I think, signals the direction of Turkey now. This also suggests they want to, as a pole of power, they would like to have a greater influence in their own region. They have typically had a bad history of this. Whenever they try to get along with their neighbors, they end up almost in conflict with all. But you see now their influence expanding. They recently assisted, of course, Azerbaijan in defeating Armenia. This has extended their influence as well. Now they're pushing a bit south. Whatever outcome will be in Syria, the Turks' influence will be drastically increased. Their main opponents, be it the Kurds, because this is both a domestic and a foreign challenge for them. The Kurds, of course, are a huge nation, if you will, but without a state, which goes across many countries. So you also want them divided, weakened, and and I think this extending the influence as far south as possible is something that would give them wider yeah, regional clout as well if they could have more say over Syria. But again, unless they want to fight everyone, they have to find a way of accommodating the Americans, the Israelis. It's unclear, possibly the Russians as well. So it's again, it's a bit unclear with the Turkey as well, because Erdogan is quite treacherous. He makes a lot of deals and he often breaks them. So it's unclear exactly how he's going to interact with other leaders. He has a very strong used very strong words against Israel, for example, and also now that Israel is pushing into Syria and conquering Syrian territory, I think this is something they would also resist, that they don't want too much Israeli influence. But again, Israel is also a big regional actor, which they want to get along with. So there's a lot of competing interest and considerations. But overall, I think expand their influence throughout the Middle East. I think this is a key objective.
Sure. Okay.
Neo-Ottoman, if you will. Yeah.
Neo-Ottoman ambitions. Interesting. Okay. And if we were just to maybe touch on China's influence or incentives as they might be, maybe simply put, a stronger Iran, a stronger Russia is just good for China. And so this is relative bad news. I know they have several billion invested in Syrian energy as well. So obviously that's something they would like to protect. I'm not sure if they can at this point. But any thoughts on China's incentives in this conflict in Syria, Glenn?
Well, I think what stands out with China is they done nothing. They made sure they didn't get pulled into some regional war. So their main approach is still to get along with everyone as it is. So they would like to, they haven't put all their bets on Iran. They also want to work well with the Saudis, the Arabs. So I think they will try to make their peace with whoever takes power. And I think this is to some extent reflects what Russia's doing now as well. If there will be a new government, they will try to work with them. So you can see what the Chinese and Russians also did with Afghanistan after the Taliban took power. They're a bit apprehensive, they're cautious, they know the risk, but they still would like to have stability in the region, which means you have to work with whoever's in power. So I think, they will try to have present economic incentives for continuing work with China, but avoid being pulled into any of the fighting. That being said, if there's a lot of pressure or threats against Iran, I would expect the Chinese to come with assistance, not necessarily military, but economic. You see this also when the Russians having problems in Europe with NATO, funding, fighting a proxy war against them. The Chinese will come in and back up the Russians with technologies, finance, trade, but they won't get directly involved in anything. So I think this is what we can expect from them also in Syria.
Countries are making moves on the geopolitical chessboard. New alliances are forming and new enemies are being made. If you're at all curious how you can position your investment portfolio to turn chaos into opportunity, you can't afford to miss the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference. January 19th and 20th at the Vancouver Convention Center. Visit cambridgehouse.com for tickets today.
Okay, pivoting over to Russia and Ukraine next. Do you feel like, I feel like we might be getting close to a peace deal. Some things have been tabled and it's possible that the worst of that war is behind us, unless you think I'm way off base. What's your perspective on that conflict today, Glenn?
No, I agree with you. I think the worst is behind. But of course, there's always this dilemma, because if it was just a Russia-Ukraine war, I think it would probably be coming towards an end now. The Ukrainian army is completely exhausted. They're shortage of manpower, equipment. If you look on the map, as the front lines collapse, the Russians have more and more opportunity to encircle larger groups of Ukrainians. so you see huge problems on the Ukrainian front, and can start to mobilize 18-year-olds if they will. The Americans sending more weapons, but it's not going to make that much difference on the battlefield. The Russians are still winning. The main problem is, of course, that this is a proxy war as well, and the West has been quite clear that they will fight till the end. So the problem has always been what happens when the Ukrainian army collapses. Because at every turn, NATO has had to escalate when this happens. So send heavier weapons, went from the F-16s to long-range strikes into Russia. But it appears that now that the Ukraine is collapsing, either NATO has to get directly involved or start to negotiate. Now, I don't think anyone has the appetite or the capabilities to fight Russia. And also with as the Russians rearmed very quickly and is now more powerful than they were even before the war, I think we're definitely heading towards, I think, a settlement unless we have an accidental war. I think the deep strikes into Russia, this put us very close, I think, to a war, because Russia considers this a direct American and NATO attack on their country. But they have responded with the Oreshnik missile, and they see this as being checked to some extent. So unless there's some very crazy escalation on the Biden administration in his final weeks, I think most likely Trump will come in. He will try to find a peaceful settlement, but even if a peaceful settlement wouldn't be found, I think he would want to reduce America's investment into this war simply because it's too pricey. He doesn't seem to care that much for Zelensky at all, and he sees the war as being rather unnecessary and also pushing Russia into the arms of China. So I think, the lack of military power now, manpower, as well as foreign backers, it will force Ukraine into a position of negotiations at some point. The main problem is what kind of a settlement, and I think many people in the West delude themselves what Russia wants in a settlement, because we haven't really accepted what Russia wants in Ukraine, which is this. They see this as an existential threat, NATO in Ukraine. They can't have it. We never accepted this for many reasons. First of all, if we accept this narrative, then this was not an unprovoked invasion. The Russians see this as fighting an existential war. They see this as self-defense. So this is always in risk of legitimizing Russia. So we kind of ignore this altogether. But if we fail to appreciate that they want to have Ukraine's neutrality restored, it's going to be very difficult to find a peaceful settlement, because everyone seems to be treating this as if it's a territorial conflict.
Yeah, right. Now, you mentioned the deep strikes into Russia recently. How would you interpret Biden's decision there in the last 3-4 months of his presidency, providing novel weapons that would have, you'd think, escalated this conflict needlessly? I mean, it's interesting. You could speculate a lot about what his motivation there was in the final months of a now lame duck presidency to begin supplying novel, aggressive weaponry to the Ukrainians. What do you think was behind that decision, if you were to guess?
Well, I think it would be two main reasons. One is the Ukrainian front lines are collapsing, and second, I think it would also be to sabotage Trump's efforts to find a peace, to end the war. Because this is a little bit similar to what Obama did in 2016. If you remember, as he was on his way out the door, he started to push their heavy sanctions on the Russians, close their consulate, expel their diplomats. So a lot of this try to disrupt the relationship as much as possible to sabotage this diplomatic goals of Trump. Now, they're quite open about this, actually. They're talking now they've been talking for months within NATO what to do if Trump would win. How can you secure military supplies even after Biden is gone? Essentially, overcoming democracy, if you will. So I think this has been a key objective. But why the Americans did it now, I think, or the consequences, it's hard to say, because if you want to look at Biden and Blinken's own words, the reason why they didn't want to supply these weapons in the past was they recognized they wouldn't have a significant impact on the battlefield. So the benefits would be limited, but it would have a huge cost in terms of risking escalation in the war against Russia. And this is what the Russians said as well. Putin back in September said very clearly that this would be considered a direct attack. The war would enter a whole new phase, because these missiles, we can say that we're shipping them to Ukraine, but these missiles, they're operated by Americans. They're the one who are using the American intelligence, the American targeting. They're guided by American satellites. There's very little the Ukrainians are doing here. They perhaps might be pushing a button, but beyond that, this is an American strike on Russia. So it's for Russia to do nothing is a very risky thing. So they have to escalate as well in order to impose a cost. And how can they do this? Of course, they have many avenues. They can start to target the American assets in the Black Sea. They can go after everything from satellites. They can go after logistic bases in Poland or Romania. There's a lot of things they can do. So the first thing they did was change their nuclear doctrine, because they might lose control over the escalation ladder. So, but I think the main tool in the toolbox has been this Oreshnik missile, because it's not a nuclear weapon, but it can bring as much damage as a nuclear weapon. So this can't be stopped. So this is a really powerful weapon, which has been used as a warning to NATO. But otherwise, I think the Russians begin to intensify the destruction of Ukraine's electric grids. I think the idea of North Korean troops being in Russia, that they were meant as a deterrent, that they could be put into play if the Americans would attack Russia with this missile. So I think they have different ways of responding. I think they like some strategic ambiguity to make it more difficult for the Americans to calculate how they will respond, which would suggest the Americans will be more cautious. But it remains to be seen, I think. But it was a strange move. And also noteworthy, given that the American people have voted for Trump. Trump said that he would end the war, begin negotiations, and this is the time when Biden decided to escalate, even though he recognized it would have little impact on the battlefield. So
yeah, because the Ukrainian front collapsing, could be a reason, but you have to. It's hard to wrap your mind around a last ditch attempt like that making an impact. I mean, I think of the basketball player just like winging the ball from the other end of the court, hoping he gets it in the net. Like maybe there's a chance this would turn the tide of the war. Highly unlikely. The sabotaging the new establishment seems much more probable. And then you got to get back. I mean, if you really want to dig into it, you're like, who actually made the decision, right? Like it probably wasn't Biden. I mean, who's actually back there and what's their intention, and sabotaging the new administration seems to make the most sense. As crazy as that is. Okay. So if we're going to assume that the Ukrainian army is breaking down, they're running out of new soldiers to deploy, the front is collapsing. As disorganized as Russia might have been at the beginning of this war, that's how they start pretty much every war. And through attrition, they end up overcoming the enemy often. That's been a strategy that we've seen from Russia many times. Maybe we're heading towards a scaling down of conflict in Europe, which would be very positive. But I have a feeling you think the opposite would be true in the Middle East, that we're not scaling down over there. And in fact, maybe this kettle is just beginning to boil. What do you think?
Well, I guess first in Europe, I'm not certain, because it depends to what extent we actually want a peace with Russia. Because if we want a peace, we have to address a lot of the sources behind this. And this has been the fact that we haven't had a mutually acceptable post-Cold War settlement. So first of all, let's say we were able to get a peace agreement which reaches the minimum demand of Russia, which is restoring Ukraine's neutrality, that is no more NATO expansion, and also the territorial concessions as a result of the war. Well, even if that's the case, the at least here in Europe, the governments still look like they want to pick a fight with Russia. So we have a lot of things which have changed. There's more with Sweden and Finland into NATO. It looks like NATO's going to militarize the Arctic more. They're militarizing the Baltic Sea. They're building a bit of a front line in the northern flank against Russia in Finland. I think there's the destabilization of Moldova. This attempt to pull them only into the Western orbit, it will be a mini Ukraine, I think. They will destabilize Moldova. Well, how will the Russians react? I think they will. It's a lot of uncertain variables here. So as long as if it's unclear if we will find a more comprehensive peace, that is one that addresses the root of the problem, which is the European security architecture, or if we will simply call it a temporary truce, that is or a ceasefire, will freeze the conflict in Ukraine, but none of the other conflicts which are linked to it will be addressed. I think we're simply going to continue through a long Cold War with finding new areas to fight. So I'm not that optimistic about Europe. I think maybe the economic crisis and political crisis we have coming in Europe will help to have less ambitions, if you will, for fighting the Russians. But I think the Russians are also quite eager to get an end to this because they have greater ambitions in the East. So they would like to close this chapter on Europe. But that being said, I think the Middle East is really the main. If Europe is coming down now, and I do think they are coming down, I think Middle East will unravel. I think I think Russia will try to stay out of it as much as possible, because I think if they pull back a bit, I think a lot of the local actors will balance each other. So it's not a need for them necessarily to be on the front line. I think Syria has been very expensive and engagement for them for the past 9 years since they got involved. So, but no, definitely Middle East, I think will be hard to contain.
When you say begin to unravel, we touched on Syria and the implications there, but maybe expand on that for me a little bit, Glenn.
Well, the entire balance of power now is gone. Again, as I mentioned before, Iran has now lost significant influence across the region, from Palestine to Lebanon, Syria. You will have new actors coming in. As we discussed as well, the Israelis will want, instead of only taking this victory, I think they will try to push harder now against Iran. Iran will have to find a way of rebalancing. I'm not saying this would happen, but it wouldn't be that crazy to assume that the Iranians might want a nuclear deterrent. Where's their deterrent now? They see, rather than emboldened US and Israel having knocked out their key allies in the Middle East, they could see this as being required. So I think a new balance of power would have to be restored. And also, I think a lot of when you have a balance of power, when you have an adversary, this also is good for internal solidarity. But what happens now that Iran is weakened? Will countries like will a lot of the Arab states still be that loyal or be into the United States if they don't see this threat from Iran being the primary source of concern? So I think there's the whole power dynamic of the region has been disrupted. So I think a lot will now try to find a new balance. But Syria will be the main focal point, I think.
Okay. Your thoughts on the BRICS as an organization? I see both headlines that will try to convince you this is an absolute challenge to Western hegemony and a very serious one, and will continue to suck trade into new financial infrastructure, and simultaneously just as many headlines that say this is far less organized, far less substance here than is being promoted. These are countries with many opposing ideologies, and the cooperation is far less than it's been made out to be. On the heels of the BRICS summit in Kazan, what's your take, Glenn? What's your take on this, the significance of the BRICS organization?
Well, now that it was on the Russian leadership, I think they pushed extra hard to make advancements. So, but I think it might slow down the progress a bit compared to the past year. But the overall trend, I think, is still there. They will still continue to do its main purpose, which is to develop an alternative economic infrastructure. Now, the speed of this, of course, is unclear. It also depends a bit on the credibility and reliability of the existing system, which the more US-centric system. But the overall trend is that states do not want to rely excessively on American technologies and supply chains. They don't want to be too dependent on American transportation corridors, the American banks, the American dollar, the payments system, SWIFT, insurances, commodity exchanges. They would like to diversify. This isn't necessarily anti-American by cutting off from US-centric systems, but rather simply to have alternatives so they can't be, will avoid rent-seeking and also be held hostage to it. So, but overall, I think it will continue in this direction. It puts a dilemma for the Americans. How will they respond? Trump suggested anyone who participates in reducing reliance on the dollar would have be faced with a 100% tariff. But I don't think you can bully your way out of this one, because the main reason why BRICS has such an appeal is because they see declining US as being less reliable. So if you're threatening countries who don't want to use your currency, it also works as an incentive why you should have a currency. It's a bit like threatening to bomb Iran if they get a nuclear weapon. Well, you're also encouraging them to get one if you're threatening them. So I think this is it could be counterproductive now, but it's hard to say the direction of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting take, and it makes a lot of sense to me that 100% tariffs on BRICS organizations would actually motivate BRICS organizations, similar to the Russian sanctions. I mean, it was sort of counterproductive to sanction and confiscate $600 billion in reserves. This really pushed Russia away from the West and into further cooperation with the East.
Yeah, the theft of the Russian money of the central bank. This is very unprecedented. It's in such a scale as well. So this is something that really shook large parts of the world. And again, you don't have to be Russia or China. Even the Indians are now quite worried because you don't want the Washington, especially when they're more desperate and unpredictable, to have a veto power over who you can trade with and the conditions that you trade. So I think this is why you will see more countries wanting to diversify and trading more in local currencies. A key problem with unipolarity would be that to only have one center of power, it would depend on keeping other centers of power down. The more you push other rising powers down, the more incentive they would have to work together and reduce dependence on the dominant center of power. So unipolarity would therefore be a temporary phenomenon. It makes sense, and I think this is what you're seeing now. So, from my perspective, the decision for the United States is, does it want to accept this multipolar system coming, or does it want to resist it? But if it resists it, it will see a lot of these new institutions, such as BRICS, being really laser focused on only reducing dependence on the US, almost becoming anti-American. I don't think this is in the interest of US or the rest of the world either. I think, at least when I speak to different political leaders or diplomats around the world, they would like to be part of an anti-hegemonic club, which is BRICS. Mm-hmm. They don't want to be part of an anti-American club, which is two very, very different things. So I think that the Americans should keep this in mind as well.
That's very important context. It's anti-hegemonic, not anti-American. Very different things. Easy to confuse them, and maybe they're one and the same depending on your perspective and context. But I really appreciate that. Okay, interesting. Glenn, thank you. I know you got to run. I know we bumped up against the end of your time today. I really appreciate you coming back on the show. I always enjoy pulling intelligence out of your gigantic brain and helping me understand these conflicts a little bit better. It's always fun chatting with you. So there's never a shortage of things to talk about. So I appreciate your time very much today.
Oh, thank you.